Hi everyone, it's Raina. So this video is looking at the astrological chart of Charles Bukowski, who passed away in the 90s, I think 1994 maybe, so over 30 years ago. And he was a novelist, a poet, and he also wrote short stories. And he had a type of style, I think that we would call a very relatable modern style. But he wrote poetry, modern poetry that was really touching. I mean, he had different themes. Sometimes he did have a very humorous side because he was quite a character and he had lived a very colorful life as an adult, and he had a lot of stories to tell. So a lot of his work, or you could say the vast majority, if not all of it, um, well, he did have a few fantasy pieces, but a lot of it seemed to be informed by his real life. And he wrote a book. I think his breakout novel was called Post Office because he actually worked in a post office. So anyway, some of you may know who I'm talking about. And he really a movie called Barfly was based on one of his. I don't know if it was. I don't think it was ever a book, but it was. He wrote a screenplay, but it was based on his life. And Mickey Rourke played him. And so, anyway, I wanted to look at a few things because this kind of theme, I've done other artists, like songwriters and actors. And one of the things that I always look for is where is that artistic spark, talent, or just desire to be creative? And if the person had a difficult background, then I also say, okay, is there anything in the chart that supports this or that shows this? Um, he was also an alcoholic for a great portion of his life. He did at the very end of his life when he knew he had, I don't know if it was lung cancer. I think he had some form of cancer that he died from, but he didn't. He abstained from drinking like for the last few months of his life. I think he began to meditate because the interesting thing about him is that he was a very self-destructive person in many ways, but at the end of the day, he wanted to live. And maybe it was because life was good at that point. He was, well known, appreciated in Europe. He was treated as this, a great writer. He was very popular he was actually born in Germany. And I think he was big there, but he might have been big in France, if I'm not mistaken. I can't really recall. But anyway, he wrote about real life. And when I first started making videos on YouTube, it was just to practice because I knew I was going to do astrology and I knew that I needed to learn more about predictive astrology. So I started just practicing in the meantime, doing all different types of videos. And if you see like one of my earlier videos, like when I first started, probably like 2014 or early 2015, I think I did a couple of videos, but like about the people who changed my life or who I consider my spiritual teachers, and I listed him as one of them. And I remember, I got some thumbs down. It could have been for something else I said because I mentioned multiple people, but sometimes our spiritual teachers come in very interesting packages. And the reason that I consider him one of my spiritual teachers, the first time I started reading him, I was like, I think I was about 19 years old. And I had moved into my first apartment, and there was like a used bookstore right across, around the corner. Oh, the good old days when, before Amazon, when you actually had bookstores all over the place. I know they still exist, but not like they used to. And I got his, probably used. I don't think I got it new, but I got his book, one of his books, Love is a Dog from Hell or whatever. That's a novel. And his poetry books, one of my favorites. If you ever are interested, one of the best ones that I think is called The Days Run Over the Hills Like Wild Horses or something like that. But anyway, the thing that I really resonated with him is that he was an outsider. He was not an attractive person. When he was growing up, he had all these boils all over his back, and he looked like a, oh gosh, what would you call him? Like just some kind of a, I don't know. I was gonna say like some kind of a gremlin. I don't really know the word to use, but he was someone who was physically unattractive. But in addition to that, he was beaten by his father. So he was physically abused by his father. And when he and his father actually threw his typewriter out of a window because he did go to briefly to he grew up in he spent most of his growing up years in LA, and he went to like the community college out there. So he was living at home even when he graduated high school, and he was I guess interested in writing, and his father just like threw that out the window. And it just goes to show that when you have a parent who really doesn't get you, the one thing that you're good at, the one thing that you have a passion for, they will hone in on, and they will try to destroy it. They try, these people who try to destroy other people's light really suck. But yeah, so he had a very difficult childhood and growing up years. And then, being an adult, that was not a piece of cake either. And so anyway, I don't want to get too much into his life story, but I just wanted to say a few things about it. So the first thing that I noticed is that he's a Leo, and Leo in astrology rules the fifth house, and he has a stellium in his fifth house, which really makes sense, because the two things that he was, I would say, very known for, he was very prolific. He was very prolific, and he was very consumed by the opposite sex. So he has a novel called Women. He has books that detail his love affairs, and he had many love affairs. So it is no surprise to me that he had Jupiter in his fifth house, because Jupiter can be, abundance of something or excess of something, and the fifth house in part can be love or love affairs. So, and it's also the house of recreational sex, probably because it's the house of pleasure. So any form of pleasure, a person like that is a pleasure seeker. So when I look at addiction, that's one of the main things that can lure a person in. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, the fifth house is one of the houses for addiction. But I don't think I've ever done a video on the astrology of addiction. I thought I did though. But anyway, if I did, I think I did. And the houses that I would list, I would say for different reasons, primarily the fifth, the eighth, and the 12th houses. So if people have planets in the fifth house, especially if they have a preponderance of energy there, that could be pleasure seekers. So life becomes this, and that's what he had, where it's just like the pursuit of pleasure. And that can involve sex for sure, but also, in his case, drinking. And I think he dabbled, he did other drugs as well, but that was his main drug of choice. And there's people like that, they just have this strong love. Let me see if he has. Yeah, now you could see it also because he has Venus in conjunction with Jupiter. the funny thing is it's an out of sign conjunction because Venus is actually in Virgo, which is very chaste. But Virgo's an earth sign, and so it can be one of those things that kind of can go both ways, where the person can be very earthy too. And so his Jupiter is in Leo, a late degree of Leo, 27 Leo. So that makes sense in terms of his artistic endeavors as well. So Jupiter can be, that's where he's lucky, is through creating. And that's what saved him, I think. I think that's what really saved him, because he had this mundane job in a post office, and he has a whole book called Factotum with all of these different types of crazy jobs that he worked, like working in a light bulb factory. Back in the day, I mean, he was born in 1920, so he spent his 20s. He did not go to World War II. He was able to escape being drafted, and he worked in a slaughterhouse. He worked in a light bulb factory. He worked in these but in those days, the United States was a very high producer. The production, not importing things, but producing it with all these factories. So a person could go from one job to the next, and they didn't have to stay there very long. They could always find a way to pay their bills. And this went on pretty, well into even the 70s to some degree. I mean, I remember doing temp work only like one day in a factory. But and that was like 1984. So there was already like a whole different system that they had arranged. But in any case, that's a really hilarious book because it just shows all the things. And it was during the wartime, I would say, maybe even afterwards. And the people that we would call hobos, the term bum or the hobo, I think that you would say those are synonymous. Some people, and they were typically men, decided to opt out of, society, mainstream society. And maybe some of them didn't work at all and were just like alcoholics and things of that nature. But some of them were actually, they might have worked when they needed to. And they were just, and I think BUKOWSKI was looking for experiences. And it's interesting because I looked at his fourth house of home and family, and he has Mercury there. And Mercury is that intellectual type of a sign. So that could indicate somebody who, in some cases, they can come from a family of intellectuals. I don't believe that in his case that was true, but it might be that he was able to find literary, and I know he was able to find literary inspiration when he was younger. Not so sure about childhood, but definitely when he was older. And I just don't want to get too far off. I want to just talk about his planets and signs of his inner planets. So his sun is in Leo, his moon is in Virgo, but 29 Virgo, so on the cusp with Libra. And that makes a lot of sense. More than the Virgo, the Libra makes sense because of that propensity to get involved in relationships or love entanglements. So even though he's officially, and actually it's 29 degrees 44 minutes, so it is very close to 0 degrees of Libra. So I'm going to almost assume he was a moon in Libra. His Mercury in Leo. So Mercury, this is important for a writer. What sign is their Mercury in? Because that's, dealing with communication, but writing in particular. In Leo, it's a fire sign. So creative, passionate, romantic. Yeah, those things definitely describe him. And he had, as a Leo is sometimes accused of narcissism, but that's an imbalanced Leo. The Leo who is balanced knows how to feel confident and in their own skin. And that, so somebody like Bukowski, he may have been dealt a difficult hand, growing up, and his physical appearance, and that can really, because it was kind of unusual. I would say he had an odd physical appearance, and that kind of thing can make some people feel have very low self-esteem and be very introverted. And he probably did have that side to himself, but a Leo, it's like it's very hard to keep that under wraps, because there's going to be like that part of themselves, even the more reticent Leos who are very effusive, there's a lot of warmth, there's a lot of self-expression. But he does have this Virgo energy that is kind of really, or earth energy, because his moon is in Virgo, he's got Venus in Virgo, then he has Mars in Scorpio. And his Sun and Mars actually square. I'll talk about that in a minute. And he has Taurus rising, another fixed sign. One of the good things about fixed signs, of course, they're stubborn as hell, but they can be very persistent. And persistence in life is key. You can have all the talent in the world, but if you throw in the towel because something isn't coming quickly enough, you don't have the patience to see it through, then how can you succeed? You're going to feel like it's not worth pursuing. And the person who believes in themselves but also is patient, yeah, I think that they do get it. They do have what they want more times than not. So, and I think too, as somebody who has Taurus rising, Taurus is ruled by a Venus. So, oh, that's funny, because usually they say if you're Taurus rising or Libra rising, you're ruled by Venus, you're going to be physically attractive. And in his case, you have the exact opposite. So let me look. Okay, so he does have a square from his Neptune to his ascendant. Neptune can be photography. And I have the opposition. And it doesn't, I was good looking growing up, so it's not something that is usually, I think usually if somebody has Libra or Taurus rising, you can almost guarantee that they're good looking. But in some cases, I guess it's like the exact opposite, which is pretty hilarious. Boy, that is so strange. He has a trine from Venus to the ascendant. What that suggests to me is that even if the person, and he wrote about this in, his stories sometimes, where he'd say that a woman would say, "You're not ugly. You have a very distinguished face." So, somebody can be ugly on paper, or, whatever you want to call it. You look at their picture and you say, wow, that person looks a certain way, but there's something charismatic about them, or attractive, which means magnetic. You're attracting. You don't have to say they're drop dead gorgeous or anything. So yeah, so very interesting. I didn't even think about that, but yeah, he had a lot of earth, and then he had this fire. So the earth side of him wanted a steady job, and that's why he worked in the post office for over 10 years. And it was around 1970, he had written this novel like in a month. He was around the age of 50 at that time. And he had already started to build up a reputation, for poetry in what they call little magazines, where they were little poetry magazines that, were on the literary side and stuff like that. But I think he decided to go for it when he wrote Post Office at around the age of 50, because he probably said, it's now or never. I'm just going to have to go for it. And it turned out that the man who published his book made him a deal that he would like pay a certain amount of money every year so that even if he wasn't selling books, he could still stay afloat. And that was the deal. And the man continued to pay him. And his popularity just grew as time went on in the 70s into the 80s. And he developed probably like a cult following and things like that. So one thing that about Bukowski's life, talking about him working in the post office, and while he was building up his writing career at not a very young age, I mean, in his 40s, trying to really make a name for himself, is Harvey Pekar. And if you saw the movie American Splendor, and I guess that was, he was a comic book writer, and he had a clerk type of position that even when he became famous, he stayed there. And, he retired from the job in 2001 and died in 2010. And at that point, when he died, he was 70 years old. But he only retired when he was like 61 or so. But the movie is a great movie, and I had no interest in his work or any exposure to it. But I just looked him up right now to see what his sun sign was, and he was a Libra. So Libra is on the other side of Virgo. Leo's on one side and Libra's on the other. So if I look at his chart, I might see some inner planets in Virgo. And in Bukowski, and the reason I say that is because the idea of the file clerk and the person who has this humble, the post office worker or something like that, these what we would call mundane type of jobs, that by the same token, the person is an artist, that it's a very strange dichotomy there. But those kinds of people, if we look at their charts, we might see the combination of earth and fire, because the fire is the creativity and the earth is the material. And so somebody who has a lot of fire and air, they may just like throw all caution to the wind and just quit their day job and go all in, whatever their artistic aspirations are. But somebody who has earth, they're going to be more cautious, even if they're a fire sign like Bukowski or an air sign like Pekar. So that's kind of, I find that very fascinating, because I have the moon in Virgo as well, having a sun sign in fire, and just like Bukowski, I have a lot of earth too, and it's like it makes you a little bit more grounded, but not the typical fire energy. It's very expansive, and a person can still be expansive if they have the sun in a fire sign, but it might make them more connected to things that are associated with work and money and stuff like that. So anyway, one thing that is interesting that is the square that Bukowski had from his sun in Leo to his Mars in Scorpio. This is when you have a square, or you could even say like an opposition between the sun and Mars, the person tends to be what I would call like the underdog. And they may feel like the underdog. They may feel like life is thwarting them in some way, or they're thwarted by life. Because the sun is our aspirational self, including our goals, and Mars is in the pursuit of those goals. And when there's a square like it is here, there is a roadblock. Something is preventing that person from achieving their goals. And that can make the person overly competitive, can make them aggressive rather than assertive, like if they can make them kind of insecure. And when somebody's insecure, they sometimes are very demanding. Instead of like just asking for what they want, they demand it because they're afraid they're not going to get it. So they think that they have to be kind of aggressive to get what they want. And that's kind of a mistake, I think, that these people make, because it tends to be off-putting by others. And that can create a vicious cycle where they feel like constantly thwarted from achieving their goals, but they might be their worst enemy in certain cases, and people can sense their insecurity. So even though he's a Leo, he has this affliction to Mars, and it also, because it's with the Leo-Scorpio combination, I feel that the ego is very strong and can be toxic with this combination. Because the person, Scorpio can be about power, and Leo can be about status. Similar to Capricorn, but in a different way. It's really about, am I being respected? Am I being valued? There's like a real strong component of the self in that. And so when it's a hard angle like this, it's like, it can be that the person has problems, maybe that shows up in relationships where they have trouble, trying to get their needs met, but also being cooperative, being able to acquiesce. That this could be the person that thinks that they should be able to call the shots. Maybe they have power struggles. And speaking of Mars, Mars is also, in his chart, forms a square to Neptune. So I think some of that sexual, I don't want to say promiscuity, even though it might have been, because he really goes into great detail in some of his books about his sexual encounters. Like he actually wrote for pornography magazines. I don't know if it was Penthouse, it might have been Hustler or something like that. Dirty stories, they were, you would call it. If it was for women, it'd be called erotica, but for men, it's like dirty stories. And some of them were also humorous too, I think. But because he was a very funny guy. And he just had so many colorful stories and these real whack jobs that he knew, And I think that comes from having Uranus in the 11th house. Uranus in astrology rules the 11th in the sign of Aquarius, and the 11th house is the collective. So if somebody has Uranus in the 11th house, they probably have a very eclectic group of friends, a lot of eccentrics in the mix. They may that just may be how it shakes out for them, is that they have a lot of people that are kind of, I would say with Bukowski, a lot of marginalized people as well. Not necessarily people who were in the mainstream. When he became more famous, he married at least twice, and one of them was to a woman who was an heiress. So it wasn't really love that made him marry her. It was probably more like money. But the other one was to the woman that he ended up, passing away while he was still married to her. And I think that she was probably the first woman that was from, I don't want to say a higher caliber type of woman, but someone who was more functional. She owned a health food store. She was more in the mainstream of society, let's say. And she happened to be a Scorpio, by the way, so his Mars in Scorpio may have very well formed a conjunction with her sun, and they had that in common, and there was an attraction there. But I wanted to say, like, Mars in Scorpio is very much about the person who wants to purge, who's looking to uncover the seedy side of life. Like, not so as a writer, he talked a lot about the kinds of people, we might even call them street people, but also people who had alcoholism, drug addiction, maybe some mental illness sometimes, people that were trying to survive, but they had a very hard time doing so because of their other issues. And, you know, these were the people that were his drinking companions and his lovers and things of that nature. And there's a story. He had these different compilations. He has a book of short stories, and one of the short stories that really touched me was called "The Most Beautiful Woman in the World," and it was about this young woman, and she had this crazy, wild behavior, and how he found out that she passed away and stuff like that. If you live in that type of in that scene, it's not uncommon to see people dying because they're on a self-destructive path. So that was kind of one of the big themes of his stories and his experiences was all of the self-destruction that goes on, and we know that that is coming from the person's past, most likely from their childhood and whatnot. But anyway, speaking of his childhood, the fourth house can be that, but the third house really can also give a window into that person's childhood. He was an only child, but the third house, because the third house can be your siblings, but it can also be your elementary school years. And he has Pluto here. Pluto here can indicate a lot of heaviness, a lot of control. And this could have applied to his home life as well. And his father was very controlling. And using physical abuse like that is very controlling, because obviously children feel intimidated by a parent who's violent. They're going to tend to obey because they can't defend themselves. But that's not, even if they do what the parent wants, it doesn't mean that's not traumatic, because it's not an affectionate, upbringing. And so Pluto here makes a lot of sense. And if that extended to his school life, I'm trying to remember, because he has a book that's his autobiography. I mean, all his books are autobiographical, but a straight autobiography called Ham on Rye that goes into his childhood and adolescence. So anyway, I want to talk about that fifth house. He has the sun here, Venus, Jupiter, and Neptune. This can give a very romantic person, namely through the sun, through Venus, and through Neptune. Jupiter here is very lucky. It can expansive. It can indicate multiple things, like multiple love affairs, all kinds of fun I think he was into sports too. I mean, like, he was into horse racing. That was his thing. But and actually, the fifth house is speculation, so gambling, and yeah, he would go to the track. Jupiter here would suggest, and Venus would suggest, these are the two benefics, which suggests that he might do well gambling. Um, but this is one of the houses of addiction, and gambling can be addictive. So he also has Neptune here, so that could be kind of like that deluded part of a person who doesn't really see the truth in what they're doing. Actually, Neptune in the fifth house can attract somebody to fall in love with addicts and people who are untruthful. Cheaters, in other words. And he did have this love of his life, this woman who I would say became his muse after her death. And I think that's when he started writing poetry in earnest. And she was an alcoholic. And so, and also with Neptune, it can be mental illness. And, some people might say, well, why would anybody want to fall in love with somebody who has mental illness? It's not that they're looking for people like that. It's because maybe it feels familiar if they had a mother who was like that. It might just be the thing that seems normalized. So anyway, Neptune in the fifth house can be very good for being imaginative, creative. Venus here can be an appreciation of the arts. And he was very fond of classical music. So here's this guy, rough around the edges in a lot of ways, but he had a refined sense of artistic appreciation. And, when you have the sun in the fifth house, it's like if you have the sun in the sixth house, which is the house of work, the house of health, you may be a health nut. You may be somebody who's like, you just want to stay productive. So it's like either the workaholic or the person who, if they're in between jobs, they find, things to keep them productive. In the fifth house, that sense of self is obtained or derived from the extent that the person is creative. So the person really lives to create. Even looking at sixth house is interesting because that's the house of work, as I stated. He had the moon here and he had Saturn. Saturn in the sixth house can indicate a person who works very hard for little money, and that definitely describes him, at least until he made it with his writing. But even I would probably say until he had that movie in like 1987, I don't know that he was making all that much money. He was getting paid to, I think he was even getting paid to go to Europe, and so he had the opportunity to maybe to travel and have his expenses paid for, but that doesn't mean that you're just raking it in. And his books were published by Black Sparrow Press, which, and then he probably signed other contracts for other types of work, maybe compilations of some of his previous work. He was published under more than one publisher, but I'm just saying that was his main press, and so I'm sure he didn't make that much money from that because it wasn't selling like in large quantities. But he did he was eventually probably financially well off enough to not have to worry about money. But by then, he was, he turned 90 in 19 I'm sorry, he turned 70 in 1990, and that was not too long after he became more mainstream with that movie. So chances are he he was already well into retirement age before he was able to take a breath and really feel that he wasn't going to have to worry about money ever again. So and plus earlier on in his life, Saturn could be those horrible jobs like working in a slaughterhouse that he had that were described in Factotum, and just very menial types of work. Saturn is the lord of karma, and it can indicate, past lives. And maybe he was, the sixth house is ruled by Virgo in astrology. There's that Virgo again. And it can be the servant or the slave, Maybe in a past life that was what he was. And it was very familiar to him. The moon in the sixth house can indicate someone who is doing something artistically for their bread. Also, the moon can indicate fluctuations. So this suggests someone who has a lot of different jobs in his lifetime. In terms of his love life, or relationships, I should say, he has Mars in the seventh along with the North Node, both in Scorpio. And like I said, and that's right, it's in the seventh house. His significant other, the last wife he had, she was a Scorpio. And maybe that was his soulmate, with the North Node in the seventh. But also, Mars here, unfortunately, he did have a history of hitting women. And I don't know, I can't remember if he ever hit her. She probably is the kind of woman that she wouldn't have tolerated that. I kind of remember something. I saw some video where he was drunk and he was sitting on the sofa. And I think she was sitting next to him. And then out of nowhere, he just kind of seemed like he slugged her. I don't know if that was his wife, but I could have sworn that it was during that era. And I remember it really disturbed me, to tell you the truth, because I'd always kind of like admired him, even though, he's very truthful about some of his violence towards women. The fact that he was talking about it, I felt like that meant that he understood that it was wrong. But, just even if somebody intellectually understands something, it doesn't mean that they change their ways. And, it's not good enough, they have to not do it. So I don't know if he ever did it with her, but it's interesting that Mars is in the seventh house. And I never thought about Mars in the seventh as being anything associated with domestic violence. I always see the fourth house, but that's usually growing up that the child may experience that. But yeah, I think because he had a parent who beat him, and parents are supposed to love their children, that whole idea of getting hit and being loved might have gotten distorted, warped, and that he kind of like imitated that behavior and did it to somebody else. And also, just when you have a parent who's supposed to be a role model who takes out their frustrations on somebody who is weaker than them, or otherwise can't defend themselves, that person may do that to somebody weaker than themselves as well. Now, what's interesting is I do think that there was at least one woman who was aggressive towards him, who actually um, hit him. There might have even been more than one, because he did have girlfriends that tended to be very interesting, let's put it that way, and they had their little issues. And I do remember some short stories where he talked about things like that. Could also be very sexual, Mars in the 7th, that the relationships are based on sex. In the 12th house, he has Chiron. Now that's interesting, because Chiron is the wounded healer. When people have Chiron in the 12th house, they may feel very guilty in life. They may feel like they've done something wrong and they have to atone for their sins. It's kind of like the Christ complex. I believe, because the 12th house can be past lives, that there might have been some kind of traumatic experience that occurred in the past life that made the person really want to atone for their sins, but they have amnesia. So it's like, how do I do this, And it can probably create like a Piscean attitude towards life, where the person feels like a victim, but they also feel that everyone is a victim, and they feel sorry for other people, and there's like always this sense of denying themselves, sacrificing themselves. I never got the impression that BUKOWSKI felt guilty all the time, but perhaps it came out in self-destructive tendencies. 12th house can be the house of self-undoing, by the way. He had the moon square Pluto, which can be very difficult. There's almost like a scorpionic moon there, but in the most challenging way. And so it's very complicated emotionally, but also that coupled with having an opposition of Venus and Uranus, the person can be, love can be a landmine in a way, because the person may be drawn to relationships, but at the same time, fearful of being smothered emotionally, not have freedom. Fire signs really crave freedom. And another thing, too, that I noticed is, I think I was going to comment on it earlier and I got sidetracked. Mars square Neptune, to me, can be or I've read, looking for the ideal sexual experience. Mars can be sexual and Neptune can be the ideal. So the person is, and Neptune can be transcendent. The person might think, this is going to change my life. And it's in Scorpio Mars. So Scorpio also has that sexual connotation, but it is in this, it's almost like this tantric yoga sense, where it's like using sex as some kind of form of a spiritual path. And then you have, it with Neptune. So that really, and the person may not even realize that. They may think that they just like engaging that way, but it's really deeper than that. It's like healing. This thing that the person is engaging in or trying, they think it's going to be. But because it's a square, it isn't cooperative. It's like actually blocking them. And there was something else here that I saw that I wanted to mention. What was it? Oh, he has a square between Mercury and, I'm sorry, a conjunction between Mercury and Neptune. So that is very good for poetry, anything that you're communicating that is a very refined type of thing, or ethereal. Actually, Neptune is a higher octave of Venus. So there is this, it's like I said, this transcendent quality. You can appreciate art, but you can appreciate it at a more mundane level and say, wow, this is really good. I really like the song. But then it becomes something that creates this feeling of transcendence. It's almost like a spiritual experience to the person. And so he, he had this he had Neptune at least in his fifth house, in the house of creativity. So I think I'm going to leave it there. For anybody that, I'll tell you something, if you stayed for this whole thing, I got to hand it to you. But I hope that you enjoyed this. If you would like a private reading, the link is below. Take care. Bye.